Great. So here is our lesson today. 12.4, simplifying rational expressions. The first 5 that I have here are just helping you recognize that when you have a fraction, remember you cannot divide by 0. You cannot have a 0 down here in the denominator. So these first 5, we are just identifying which values of x would make this not work, and so those values are excluded in our answer that we get. The next 3, and then I've got one more, we're going to actually give those excluded values, and then we're going to simplify them. So these first 5 here in red, as you look at this denominator, and this you have to look at the original problem, and you look at that denominator and you say, which value would x not be allowed to be? Well, if you were to set, and you should be able to see this without setting it equal to 0, but I want to show you if you can't recognize it as easily as this first one, you simply set the denominator equal to 0, find out what x would equal, and then in the problem, x cannot be that value in the denominator. So when 10x is equal to 0, you divide by 10, you get x is equal to 0. So the excluded value for this number 1, x cannot equal 0. Because if you put 0 down there, you would get 0 in your denominator. We can't divide by 0. Number 2, if you set 2x plus 14 equal to 0, you're going to have to remember to subtract 14 from both sides, and then you divide by 2 on each side, and you get x equals -7. That gives us the excluded value that x cannot be -7 in that fraction. Because if you put a -7 right here for your x value, 2 times -7 is -14, plus 14 is 0. You cannot have 0 in the denominator. So very straightforward way to find out what x, or in this case v, or in this case w, whatever, what your denominator cannot equal is simply to set your denominator equal to 0 and solve. Number 3, v squared minus 9 equals 0. Well, I recognize that this is the difference of 2 perfect squares. So when I factor this, I would get a v plus 3, and I would get a v minus 3. Remember, you square root the first term, so you put v as the first term in each of your parentheses. You square root the 9 and put a 3 in each of the parentheses, and one gets plus, one gets minus. So when you go to use the 0 product property, you get v would equal either a positive or a -3. So the 2 excluded values in this particular problem would be v could not equal positive or -3. And you always use that original fraction, set that denominator equal to 0 to find out what your denominator is not allowed to be. Now, notice on this one we have 8w squared plus a w plus a 5. This is a trinomial, what we spent time last chapter solving. And so we could actually try x factoring. We could try regular factoring. We could use the quadratic formula. But if we can remember the discriminant, it's going to save us just a little bit of work. Remember, the discriminant lesson said that if your variable, b squared minus 4ac, if that is less than 0, you aren't getting any real solutions. If b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, then you do have one real solution. And if b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, then you would have 2 real solutions. Well, when you look at this, b squared is going to be 1 times 1, 1 squared, which is 1, minus 4 times a, which is 8, times 5, which is C, which is 5. And when you take 1 minus all of this, you get a negative value. So there is not going to be a real number solution. So this has no excluded values. And I didn't have to go through all of the work of the quadratic formula. I can just say, okay, my determinant tells me that there are no real solutions, so I'm okay with this one. And the fifth one I put on here just to make sure that you would recognize 2x over 6. Well, if 6 is my denominator, then I'm okay, because I'm not going to put anything in the denominator that's going to make it equal 0. So this one would have no excluded values, just like number 4. So there would be no exclusions because of the denominator. Okay, so this is just the first part of this lesson, is checking that denominator. What your assignment is actually going to be is going to be like these next 4 questions. You have to give the excluded values, so do that first, and then you're going to simplify. So as I look at this denominator, I can see that I could not let D equal 8, because 8 minus 8 is 0. So my excluded value, D, is not allowed to be 8. And then as I go to simplify this, remember this D is attached to an 8. This D is attached to a negative 8. So we cannot simplify this at all. So my simplified answer is going to be D plus 8 over D minus 8. Now, as you can imagine, that's not going to happen very often. Usually you're going to have things to simplify. But just to let you know, not every fraction that you see can be simplified. As you look at number 2, check that denominator first. Do not simplify and then check the denominator. Check the denominator first. I recognize that this is the difference of 2 squares. So I know that when I put my 2 parentheses here, it would be a square root of g squared is g in each of the parentheses. Square root of 16 is 4 in each of my parentheses. One would get a plus sign, one would get a minus sign. And when I set that equal to 0 and use my zero product property, I would get a positive 4 or a negative 4. So my 2 excluded values, G could not equal positive and negative 4. Now, when I go to simplify this, the numerator is going to stay G plus 4. The denominator, I just told you, would factor to G plus 4 and G minus 4. Oh my goodness, there we go. And now that these are being multiplied, I can actually cancel the G plus 4 and the G plus 4, because that is one entire thing that is identical. And that G plus 4 cancels out. So my simplified version would be 1 over G minus 4. So just simplifying fractions, hopefully pretty familiar with that, but have added these excluded values. And I thought this one was kind of interesting. You look down here and nothing looks like it's going to simplify. You look up here and we're going to be able to take a 2, going to be my GCF. So if I take a 2 and factor that out, I get U minus 3. And then I have a 3 minus U. And if you notice, these are, what would you call those? Reciprocals? They're really, really similar. They just have opposing signs. So this U is positive, this U is negative, this 3 is negative, this 3 is positive. So all we have to do is factor out a negative 1. And it does not matter whether you factor out of the top or the bottom, because you're going to simplify it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and factor it out of the top, since I've already got a 2 out here. I'm going to pull a negative 1 out of this parenthesis. When I take a negative 1 out, that's going to leave me with a negative 2 in front as my coefficient there. And when I take out a negative sign, that's going to actually flip these. It's going to turn the 3 positive and the U negative. So I'm going to get 3 minus U over 3 minus U. And that's kind of a crazy one. Unfortunately, I don't think you have one of those on your homework. But when you see that those are so close, um, if you just pull out a negative, that flips those signs and you can end up canceling your parentheses here. Your final answer would be -2. And I do have one more here, and it works the same way. I just wanted to kind of give you lots of different examples because, sometimes you're just factoring out a GCF. Sometimes you can just look at the top and the bottom and simplify it. But this particular one, notice we've got an m to the third plus 10m squared plus 25m. So right away, I see that it is a trinomial. And my GCF is going to be an m. So I'm going to take an m out, and I'm going to be left with m squared plus 10m plus 25. I'm not sure if you recognize this or not, but 25 is a perfect square. And the square root of 25 is 5. And if you take 5 and add it to 5, you get 10. So this is actually a perfect square trinomial. And when you go to factor that, these are both pluses. So you square root the m squared to get m. You know it's going to be a positive because your middle term is positive. And square root of 25 is 5. Now, notice the difference between what we did before. The previous one, the middle term had dropped out, so we put a plus and a minus in each of our parentheses. This one, because we do have a middle term, we actually added 5 both times. 5 and 5 give me 10. 5 times 5 gives me 25. So when I set this denominator equal to 0, I want you to notice m would either equal 0 in our zero product property, or m plus 5 is going to equal 0. And if m plus 5 equals 0, you subtract 5 from both sides, and you get m is -5. So these two values are our excluded values. Okay, this m, you can't have just a 0, because 0 plus 0 plus 0 gives me a 0 in the denominator. At the same time, if I put -5 in here, I'm going to get negative, what is that? Is it like 125? And then I'm going to add to that, I shouldn't have done this without being on tape and under pressure. 25 times 10 is what, 250? And then subtracting 5 carrier 2, 125. Yeah, because you get a positive 250 and 2 negative 125s, it's going to give you a 0 in the denominator. Can't have that. So these are our two excluded values. Second part of the problem is to go ahead and simplify. So if this is my new fraction, m plus 5 over m times m plus 5 squared, I can divide one of the m plus 5s from the bottom with the m plus 5 at the top. And that leaves me 1 over. Notice I have to show that this was a fraction. Even though everything canceled out, I've got a 1 up there at the top, and I still have an m times m plus 5. Now, sometimes we leave it like that. Sometimes I've seen it written as m squared plus 5m, which is just distributing it back in. Either one of these answers is fine. And if you notice page 798, 13, 17, 21, 25, 29, you're going to give me the excluded values, and then you're going to go ahead and simplify. And please check your work. Remember to send me pictures of your completed work. Hope everybody's doing well. And if you want to stop in, Zoom hour is Thursday from 1 to 2. I'd love to see you.